Good morning. Happy Valentine's Day, disability advocates. This is our weekly update on what is happening at the federal level with regard to Medicaid cuts, and things are starting to happen. So today we're going to be talking about where we are at the moment in time and what you can do next week, action steps that you can take. So there are lots of ways that Medicaid cuts can happen. We are starting to see a couple versions of reconciliation bills moving in the first phases, and we'll talk about what specifically is happening both on the Senate and the U.S. House side. We have a budget bill, the normal budget bill, that is starting to move forward, and the continued threat, I would say, of impoundment or stop payment. All of these things could lead to Medicaid cuts, and we're starting to get a clearer and clearer picture of how those things are moving forward. This is a very busy slide. You may want to close your eyes so you're not for a little bit. It's the best we could do to kind of give you an overall picture of all of the ways that are moving right now on Medicaid cuts. The little star on the top tells you which week we're on. We are at the end of the week of February 10th. And you can see that we have 4 more weeks before we get to the magic date of March 14th, which is when the federal government will shut down because it doesn't have any more money to run unless Congress passes either a budget or a continuing resolution. So this time block from now until March 14th is pretty critically important, and we will see several things moving at the same time, all of which may have the ability to make some cuts to Medicaid programs. So on the next slide, we'll talk about the details, but what you should know that's happened this week is the Senate has introduced its first reconciliation bill, and that there are about $175 billion worth of cuts associated with that bill, and that they are assigning which Senate committees should look for cuts in the areas that those committees cover, and that one of the committees assigned to find cuts is the committee that covers Medicaid and education issues. The U.S. House has introduced its one bill reconciliation plan, which the resolution passed yesterday. That includes $2 trillion cuts to mandatory spending programs. Medicaid is a mandatory spending program, and specifically it has assigned $880 billion worth of cuts to the committee that oversees Medicaid. There is a small group of House Republicans called the Freedom Caucus that tends to be much more fiscally conservative. They have been negotiating with the U.S. Senate behind the scenes and have their own plan that follows the Senate's preferred 2 reconciliation bill approach. And it does look like they have a more fiscally conservative version of both reconciliation bills in the hopper. One was introduced Monday this week that is kind of the companion to Senate Reconciliation Bill 1, but it requires deeper cuts. And then both the U.S. Senate and the Freedom Caucus Reconciliation 2, they have not introduced yet, but say are ready, and we would anticipate that those would call for deeper cuts than potentially the one bill reconciliation plan. The House, you can also see that there are several other things. We mentioned, the federal government is funded through March 14th. And after that, Congress either needs to pass a budget bill or a resolution, or otherwise the government shuts down. We have a debt ceiling that needs to be reauthorized, and also a new wrinkle where we saw a couple weeks ago there has been a willingness to simply stop payments or use impoundment to not release money that Congress has already appropriated. Okay, so I kind of covered this verbally. This may be a little bit easier on your eyes. The important thing to remember is you don't have to know every bit of this process. What's important is the same menu of Medicaid cut ideas are being discussed. This is none of the ideas that would affect the money flowing to states, none of it is different. It's just a matter of which ideas get included and how deep the cuts are. I'll draw your attention to the middle column, because that, I think, gives us a really clear picture that Medicaid cuts are very clearly on the table and that they won't be around the edges. The House bill requires $2 trillion in cuts to mandatory spending. And mandatory spending is essentially Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And we know that the current administration has pledged not to touch Social Security and Medicare, which leaves Medicaid. The committee that covers Medicaid is told to find at least $880 billion in cuts. Publicly, the speaker has said there's a lot of support for adding Medicaid work requirements. Well, that will only save about $109 billion. So you can see that we aren't looking at only one idea on that menu that we keep talking about. It is probably multiple things to get to that large number of $880 billion. There's also been a lot of discussion about fraud, waste, and abuse, and a desire to stop improper payments. We don't really know what that might mean, but I think that's, that would be something to watch. And there's also been discussion of a number of other ideas. It is clear that the House Freedom Caucus has publicly said that they support per capita caps. So the big piece to take away from this is there's definitely a very large target on Medicaid, and that all of the 6 ideas we've been talking about, you have to do multiple of them to get up to $880 billion. Just to give you a sense of what the federal government spends its money on and how much is spent on Medicaid. This is a convenient graph from our friends at the Congressional Budget Office. You can see that Medicaid is about $618 billion of spending a year. And that is largely money that comes to states to help to operate their Medicaid programs. It covers the costs of the health and long-term care services that people receive. So those dollars are actually paying workers and people to do things for the folks who are in Medicaid. And we get about $9 billion of federal Medicaid money to help run our Medicaid programs. The state puts in more than that. We have that, the state puts in about another $3.7 billion. So it's a really significant amount of the state budget that we spend on Medicaid. It's about 26% of the state budget. And just for context, the amount of money we get from the federal government to help with running our Medicaid programs is about the same as what we collect in individual income taxes in a year. So this is a really big chunk of money that comes to the states. And when the federal government is talking about Medicaid cuts that impact the amount of federal money that goes to states, you can see very quickly that we might end up with a really large hole in our budget, which would provoke, for cuts made by the state to make our budget whole. So there has been a lot of activity that has gone on in the past week. The United States Senate did send a letter to their colleagues. This is a Senate Democratic letter saying, hey, Medicaid, this is not a great place to do cuts. And this is positive, right? This is something that they have put out and said, we are not supportive of Medicaid cuts. One thing I would point out for our group is that it doesn't specifically mention home and community-based services like family care, IRIS, and CLTS. So I think it's useful to make sure that senators know that the institution diversion programs, family care, IRIS, CLTS, are really, really cost effective. They're also optional under Medicaid law. And so it's important to, thank them for this initial support. In our purposes, we have one Democratic U.S. Senator who signed on to this letter, and that her name is Tammy Baldwin. But this is an opportunity to kind of, do a thank you and then do some more asks to make sure that the programs that we know people rely on that keep them out of much more expensive settings are flagged as this is where we should be investing our money. Here's a list of little steps to get you started if you wanted to contact Tammy Baldwin to thank her for signing on to that letter. It's always a great opportunity to tell your Medicaid story again. And I think at this point, there are so many of you that are working on these issues that you may know of other people in your communities, other disability constituents who may have not connected with their legislators yet, but you can maybe provided an invitation, some additional people that are affected by Medicaid cuts. And I think you can offer to be a resource for your lawmakers and say, hey, here's my story. I know other people. I want to help you tell those stories and act in a way that is, asking her to not only elevate what you're saying and other voices, but be an active participant in helping legislators who are supportive of Medicaid do that. And you'll see that that's a theme in what we talk about today. I think you can also ask for programs that are like family care and IRIS to be prioritized and protected because they're not right now. Mandatory services include institutional services, but they don't include the home and community-based services, which our state and many others has figured out is a very cost-effective way to keep people in their communities and able to participate and work and be engaged in their communities and out of institutional settings. So I think it is appropriate to raise the flag of like, look, what is required here and what our state has, figured out is a really good investment. They're not the same. We should really be, investing in the cost-effective solutions, which also happen to be where most people want to live, and making sure that when cuts, if there are cuts, that we're not cutting off the things that people value the most. The other thing that I think is important, a couple weeks ago, we saw the administration freeze a lot of money that had been appropriated already by Congress, and that did include the Medicaid portal initially. So I think that it's really important to start asking our congressional friends about what are the guarantees? How are you going to address this now new threat that money Congress has authorized could be stopped at any time? And that includes Medicaid, right? And funding for disability and aging organizations that serve the people in their districts. I think it's important to start raising that question, because if money that Congress says it's okay to spend ends up not being spent, that has a lot of impact on, the people who are relying on those services, as well as the providers who are trying to get paid for work they've already done. Senator Baldwin also serves on an important committee. One of the Senate Reconciliation Bill 1 does direct her committee on health and education to find cuts. So she is in a position on one of the potential paths that could result in cuts to Medicaid to speak up about that. And we have a series of things that you can ask her, as the committee starts making discussions about, what cuts that they are identifying within the world of health and education. It can be really hard for disability constituents to follow what is being debated and what those cuts might be, what those recommendations might be. And I think it's a good idea to let her know, hey, we are watching and we want to participate and we want to provide information that could be helpful to this committee as they're trying to decide what cuts should be included. Some level of transparency, what is the communication that she can give out to constituents in terms of what are the ideas being considered? How can the public participate in those meetings? How can we share information with her that she might be able to bring up with her colleagues on this committee or on the floor, if the bill advances to the floor? These are all things where we are asking for a relationship of how can you get information to us that is helpful to understand what is going on, and how can we provide information to you that can help inform this committee and elevate our stories and our concerns. And then, of course, the other ask you can have for her is to specifically make sure that the cuts that the committee is identifying aren't to Medicaid, special education, or disability and aging organizations that serve people in Wisconsin. U.S. Senator Ron Johnson did not sign on to the letter that his Democratic colleague sent to leadership, but there's no reason Republican members can't write their own letter urging party leaders not to cut Medicaid, and that could be a nice ask for him. We know that there are lots of folks that are contacting his office with concerns about Medicaid, so it may be also a great ask to ask for a roundtable to hear directly from people who rely on Medicaid for health or long-term care, or rely on Medicaid to be paid for providing that care. Again, it's always appropriate to raise the programs that are really critical for people with disabilities that are also optional under federal Medicaid law. Home and community-based services are really important as a way to keep people out of much more expensive settings. So it's always a good idea to raise that with every legislator, but especially Senator Johnson, to make sure that he understands these are the kinds of investments that really should be prioritized and protected. And again, a similar ask about, making sure the flow of money for reimbursements to Medicaid continues flowing. I think that's really important for legislators to start hearing. So our congressional representatives, I think it's still appropriate to ask the question, are you supportive or not supportive of Medicaid cuts? Now we have a House budget resolution that is out that is very clearly saying we are looking for $880 billion in cuts, and there's a lot of public discussion about Medicaid cuts in particular, and what kinds of cuts there is broad support for, namely work requirements and this idea of stopping improper payments. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it's really clear doing just those two things isn't going to achieve the level of cutting that is proposed by what the House One Bill resolution says. So I think it's now time to also, ask some further questions of our congressional delegation. It's great if you have a member who says, I do not support Medicaid cuts, but now it's time to call the question about, well, what are you doing to prevent those cuts from happening? What's the plan? What's your strategy? How can we participate and advance your strategy to, help you in your work to prevent these cuts? If you have members who are not really giving you an opinion or maybe support some level of cuts, I think it's time to know what changes they want to make to Medicaid, and really, challenge them to think about what they think the impact will be to Wisconsin's budget, to its workforce, to people with disabilities who need help over a long period of time. The congressional delegation, to my knowledge, has not written its own letter that does not support Medicaid cuts. But they could, and we have a sample letter that you can modify. If you wanted to say, hey, I would really like you to, work with your colleagues to circulate a letter in opposition to Medicaid cuts, let us know. We can send you this letter. You can tailor it, and you can say, hey, how about you guys use this language or something similar, and circulate your own letter, just like the U.S. Senate did, U.S. Senate Democrats did. Again, not trying to make it hard, trying to make it easy. They can certainly modify a letter, but it gives you something to ask for that they could in fact do. Next week, we talked about this last week, but next week is now in-district work week. So all of our congressional reps and our U.S. senators will be home. Many of you have reached out to try and get in-district meetings that week. If you don't have a meeting, you can just drop by the office, and you may want to do that with a group of people and ask for a meeting or speak with staff. I think it's important to kind of take those photos to document your presence, document that you are concerned about these issues, document your meetings, and make sure that you're letting people know what you're doing. There are a couple of districts that are holding in listening sessions. I think specifically District 6, U.S. Representative Glenn Grothman is having 4 listening sessions in town halls. So that's a great opportunity for folks in that district to go and speak about Medicaid. Other districts, I haven't seen as much, town halls listed, but that's a great ask for them, even if it's not, during this week. Asking for a Medicaid town hall in every congressional district is a great way to, really tell folks, hey, we're watching this and we want to be engaged with you, and we want you to hold an event that everybody can come to and specifically talk about this issue. I think it's probably time to do that. We have a number of grassroots volunteers who are organized by congressional districts, and they have some Facebook groups that you can join. So if you are looking for disability constituents, friends in your area to connect with and maybe do some planning, maybe go to a meeting together, maybe do some press work, maybe, do some coordinating of sharing of stories. Connect with these Facebook groups, and kind of get in on the plan behind the scenes with local volunteers and see what you can do. There's a lot of people who have been mobilized and have done things as individual people, which is great. All of us need to do that, but there is power and comfort in a group as well, and meeting new people who are also doing the same thing for the same reasons. So I encourage you, and you will get these slides later and the links work, but I encourage you to kind of put yourself out there as somebody who's really interested in participating with what's going on in your district, and just seeing what you can contribute and what you can do. I'm going to spend a little time just talking about several Medicaid proposals that we understand are kind of accepted because we expect as being a good idea by some of the folks that have put forward these budget resolutions. We keep hearing about Medicaid work requirements having rather broad support in the caucus. And Medicaid work requirements, I think the better way to frame that is their prove you are already working requirements, because most people in Medicaid programs are working. So there isn't a whole group of people that are in Medicaid who are simply not working. There are lots of people who are caregivers of either young children or people with disabilities, and they are working doing caregiving, but they're not getting paid to do that. There are quite a few people in Medicaid who fit that bill. But for the most part, the majority of people are actually in Medicaid are actually working jobs. So the work requirement idea isn't actually a huge cost saver. It's one of the lowest amounts in the menu of ideas. It's about $120 billion is what the Congressional Budget Office impact says. So this is not a big cost savings. And the way that you achieve savings is really when people lose coverage. Like that is how the work requirements save money. It isn't that people who aren't working all of a sudden do and work enough that they can qualify to get off Medicaid and get private insurance. That isn't what happens. What happens is the administrative requirements that are put in place so that for people to prove that they're working are hard enough, where a lot of people either don't fill it out correctly or miss deadlines, and then they lose their coverage because of it. It's also important to know that this is actually another way to cost shift and add costs to states, because if you are going to require people to either prove that they are working or prove that they are exempt from work requirements, you need a lot of administration and people to do those checks. And the Congressional Budget Office has actually said, well, if you put in a work requirement, it will cost states about $65 billion over 10 years to just do the work of figuring out whether somebody is or isn't working, or they are or aren't exempt from working. So we've had a number of states try this, and there was just an article that came out this morning where the two states, Georgia and Arkansas, that have put in work requirements have figured out that they aren't doing what they want to change how they're doing work requirements, because all of the ideas they had about how it would work are proving not to be real in practice. So I think when you hear we support work requirements, first thing to know is this is actually a Medicaid cut. It's on the list of menu ideas. It does have a number of savings. The way that you save those dollars is by people losing their coverage, and that it does cost states to do the administrative work to prove for when people have to prove they're already working, or they have to continue to prove that they're exempt from work requirements. Just a little more on this. A lot of times work requirements are talked about in terms of applying it to the able-bodied Medicaid population, and that's in quotes. In Wisconsin, Badger Care is considered the able-bodied Medicaid program, but there are lots and lots of people in Badger Care who have disabilities. So people with mental illness, people who are applying for SSDI and are waiting on a disability determination, which can take up to a couple of years. That's a group of people in Badger Care. People with chronic conditions, sometimes that can result in disability, on a short-term or longer-term basis. Those are folks that are in Badger Care. You have a lot of unpaid caregivers in Badger Care. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities who don't meet the functional screen criteria to qualify for family care IRIS are in Badger Care. A lot of our paid caregivers who provide services to family care and IRIS participants are in Badger Care. And all of those people would be subjected to prove your working requirements or have to prove that they're exempt from work requirements in order to keep their Badger Care. For a lot of people, I would also add there's a lot of low-income seniors that are in Badger Care who aren't yet 65. So those folks might be subject to work requirements too. And the ways people lose their health care, whenever you have a process that has lots of paperwork associated with it, folks can fill that out incorrectly, or the administrating agency can make their own mistakes. And when mistakes happen, they might not be easy to correct, and they could take a lot of time, perhaps more time than the person has to complete that paperwork to avoid losing their health care and health insurance. There's also a lot of populations that I just mentioned who don't have great access to technology, who are non-drivers, who are trying to do these administrative requirements while they're ill, or maybe don't have anybody to help them. Sometimes things from the government aren't necessarily easy to understand. So these are all processes. Whenever you put in a process, it becomes up to the person who needs the health care or long-term care to figure out how to navigate that process successfully to keep their services. And a lot of people aren't able to do that. That's how work requirements save money. And we have a recent example with the unwinding that happened, where there had to be a lot of effort and a lot of communication to help people understand what they needed to do in order to keep their coverage in the past year. So we can kind of see how just subtle changes to administrative process have really resulted in a lot of people losing coverage accidentally, who are qualified to receive it. The other thing we're hearing a lot about is fraud, waste, and abuse. And I just want to be clear with folks that the overall occurrence of fraud in Medicaid appears to be very low. So there's kind of two paths with how people think about fraud in Medicaid. One is people who shouldn't be getting Medicaid health or long-term care services are getting it anyway. So it's that idea that there are people who don't meet eligibility criteria who are receiving these services. I feel like that's probably mostly untrue, because the eligibility criteria, and many of you who work with people in Medicaid or who are in Medicaid know it's pretty strict. Like, you have to keep proving that you meet the financial, income and asset test, or functional screen criteria, at least on an annual basis, and sometimes, you know, sooner than that, 6 to 12 months. So there are lots of processes that are already in place that really screen whether people are eligible to get into Medicaid or not. And I think that's one thing we hear from lawmakers, is that they feel like there are people in Medicaid that shouldn't be there. And there are actually lots and lots of processes to make sure that nobody who shouldn't be in Medicaid gets in. The other kind of flip for fraud is that lawmakers believe that there are people getting paid for with Medicaid dollars for things they shouldn't get paid for. Again, that seems like it is a belief rather than a fact. Wisconsin automatically screens and reimbursement claims for frauds and mistakes before they ever submit anything to the federal level for payment. And if you're a provider and have interacted with the Forward Health Portal, you know that if you submit a claim that has a mistake, you might get a flag, or you might get a another layer of review to make sure that what you're submitting is in fact, correct, the right thing. So that is a useful thing to talk about, I think, with your federal lawmakers, because I'm not sure that they understand the protocols that are in place that the state does before they ever submit anything to the federal Centers for Medicaid Services for payment. We also have an Office of Inspector General in the state that investigates fraudulent claims, and the federal level has the same thing. And you can see on the screen that of all of the claims that Wisconsin submits for Medicaid reimbursement, I don't know what that number is, but it's a lot when you consider there's 1.2 million people in Medicaid, and they are using health and long-term care and all of the services that those 1.2 million people are using are billed. They become reimbursement requests. It's a huge, huge volume of reimbursement requests that are submitted to the federal government by the state. And only 147 of them were flagged at the federal level for being, or 143 were flagged as being, these might not be great. And only about 7 of those total claims were indicted and charged, and only 5 resulted in a conviction. So, you'll never get 100% fraud free, but the idea that there's a huge amount of savings because there's lots of improper payments, or that people are on the program that shouldn't be, I don't think it bears out in the numbers and the processes the state has in place to prevent exactly those things. The other thing that has been a topic of conversation is this idea of stopping improper payments at the federal level. We have kind of seen in the press that the DOJ committee is now looking at Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, and has made some statements that they found many billions of dollars of improper payments. We have no idea what data they are looking at, or whether they know what is a acceptable payment or not, or whether they know that states have already screened against the rules that CMS has for payments that, for reimbursement requests that aren't correct. So there is some language out in the world that is saying, oh, there's a whole bunch of improper payments associated with these programs, but there's not a transparent process here. We have no idea what is being looked at, or whether the things that are being flagged are in fact improper payments, or just something that the people who are looking at the information don't understand. We also do not see, there's no process for notification or recourse or correction or timeline where issues may be solved, or guarantee that if you start freezing payments, it won't happen again. This is actually a really big deal because Medicaid is a reimbursement system. It's paying for services that have already been provided. And if you're stopping payments at the federal level, what you're doing is making sure that people who are relying on that money coming to them to cover salaries and costs associated with services they've already provided aren't getting paid. The immediate impact for people when their money, when the money that they're expecting doesn't come, is that it really affects a lot of small providers, and they quickly have to start laying off employees or may have to close their businesses. There are a lot of Medicaid funded providers, and maybe Medicaid, they don't even provide only services to Medicaid people. They might have a good portion of their budget is coming from Medicaid dollars, but they may have other sources of money. Medicaid is such an important source of operating revenue that any disruption to it can actually threaten the existence of the business. And of course, people feel the impact of those payments stopping quickly, especially if you have daily and ongoing care needs, like personal care or dialysis. As soon as that money becomes disrupted and people can't get paid for providing those individual services, it means those services aren't going to be provided. So I think this is really something that lawmakers need to understand. It isn't okay for the federal government to start second and third guessing after we've already had an entire process that has screened out for improper payments. When they're stopping federal dollars from flowing to states, this is what's happening. Like, that means that people can't get paid, that businesses suffer and maybe, have to start taking steps, and it means people don't get care. A few other steps. Just yesterday, the Democratic Assembly and state senators sent a letter to the congressional delegation, with deep concerns about Medicaid cuts. It's a good opportunity to pivot and connect with your state and senator and state representative. Leverage the work you've already done. A lot of you have already told your Medicaid story to your federal legislators. Now you can also pivot and share your story with your state senator and state representative. They have been hearing from advocates and individuals already about what would Medicaid cuts mean to them in their lives. And I think that's a really important message to start sending to state legislators, because those federal cuts will mean they have a bunch of bad decisions that get handed to them that are going to impact people in their districts. The other thing you can do besides sharing your story, which is very helpful because it's helpful for them to be able to hear from many people, that enables them to say, hey, I'm hearing a lot about Medicaid cuts. I don't think that's great. And this is what people are telling me. You're giving them information that they can choose to elevate, but you can also give them ideas. And I'm going to share with you a little story. I was in the Capitol, I don't know, Tuesday, I think, meeting with a newly elected member of the legislature. And I was not there to talk about Medicaid. Of course I did, because as you do, you work in Medicaid to every conversation you have, right? But I was there to introduce our organization. And I talked about the importance of long-term care and some other things. And the representative volunteered and said, I met with a lovely 24-year-old woman who was working, and I could kind of see the dots connect. She had a disability. And then I started talking about what Medicaid cuts. And she's like, we talked about family care. And we talked about, you know, all the things that she wants to do and wanting to change jobs. She had full recollection of her constituent and what her constituent wants to do. She even helped her constituent write a better resume. And I said, you know, that's a person that's a great connection. And she said, you know, my constituent told me she knew other people who might be affected by that. I said, you know, maybe you could contact that constituent and she could connect you with some other things. And the light bulb went off. She started taking notes. I said, you know, it would be great to have a little press gathering or something that, you know, there's a lot of people affected by these changes. And she took some more notes. And then she recalled, hey, I know this other person who is a son of somebody I'm friends with who works for the Brewers. Would these cuts affect him? He has a disability. And she talked about how he works for the Brewers and how important it was that, and how the whole team kind of rallied around him and made him part of the team. And I said, yes, I think it would. I said, well, that's another great story that you could elevate. And she took some more notes. So I have no idea if that legislator is going to contact her constituent and any of those things are going to happen, but you can be the spark and the creativity to give them those ideas. Really clear that she remembered a person with a disability. She remembered her whole story. She remembered the whole interaction. She was connecting it to other people with disabilities she knew, and she was getting that these things are going to impact those people that she has a relationship with. And if you can be the spark to say, yes, there are others like me, and let's do something about it, that could be really, really powerful. So there's a number of ideas on this screen. You can decide which ones are for you. But I think it is important to make those connections, and it's just proof that legislators remember them. There are a number of people who are doing county resolutions. Again, if you want the language on those, let us know. When your county board does pass a resolution, make sure it's sent to the state senator and representatives and the whole federal delegation. There are a number of providers who are working to kind of make sure lawmakers understand the impact to small business. This is one that the Disability Service, DSPN, has put out. You can link to that PDF here and fill it out if you are a provider. Here are some other ways that you can kind of offer some context about what your business does and who it serves and how much of your budget is tied to Medicaid dollars. Like what would happen if those dollars went down, not only to your workers, to the people you serve, and what's the impact on the community. So it was really great that a lot of providers are taking those steps, and I think it's time to do that even more now. Last thing, we have put together a whole social media calendar. There's 18 days worth of images and blurbs that you can copy and paste into your social media posts. If you're managing your own page, you can do that. If you're managing your organization's page, these are free and available to use. And the links, for the full calendar and just the images, if you want to write your own blurb, are online with the links here. Another news article this week, we're starting to get some more press activity. So hopefully by next week, we will have a lot more articles to share. But this one was particularly good about, outlining all of the cuts and the proposals that Congress is making and what it would mean. So this is a good article that you might want to share on your social media. Okay. Closing slides. 5 things. Do what you can, do something every day. Be present, be persistent. This is the time to take up space. This is the time to invite more people to take up space with you. We will have to do this for weeks. It's important that we do this because that's the only way that we will slow down and alter what could happen into something that is less impactful. So this is kind of prairie chicken politics. You puff yourself up and you gather with all your other chickens and you make yourself look big and you take a lot of time. Lawmakers, their whole job is to deal with constituents that you are not imposing on them. You're taking up their time and you're making them focus their time on something that's really important to you, which is Medicaid. Lawmakers know that we're watching, and we have to keep engaging and keep watching so they know that if they make decisions that are going to impact our economy and the people who rely on Medicaid, it will not be unnoticed. We have a lot of time here to use, and we can use it very well. These are the things for next week. And when you join us again at next Friday's webinar, I'm sure the landscape will have changed and we will have changed the things that you can do. This is kind of a push and pull of, they make a change, we make a change. They make a change, we make a change. We are constantly moving and we're moving forward, and we can win if we do this together. So I'm going to stop now. And if there's any questions in the Q&A, we can go to them.